Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeff Badnock, and on behalf of the Alumni Association Community Lecture Series Coordinating Committee, I'm happy to welcome you to our 6th lecture in this year's series. Before we begin, I have a few brief announcements. First, as always, check your cell phones, make sure that they're on mute, not going to ring in the middle of our presentation. Many of you have asked about DVDs about this series. They are available. We'll have out front, there was a sign-up. If you would like, we'll also have that sign-up available at the reception, which will immediately follow tonight's lecture. In addition, the series will be rebroadcast on MCAT, channel 189, beginning on Monday, the 27th. At 7 p.m. and we'll be repeating the following Saturday at 6 p.m. and it will run for 6 weeks just as this series has. So if for some reason you missed a lecture, you wanted to hear another one again, tune in to MCAT. You can also watch MCAT live streamed on the internet at mcat.org. We will hold our customary reception following tonight's lecture and question series. Please join us in the 330 rooms, which are that way. So come out of the theater and turn left, go through the double doors, take a sharp left at the end of the corridor, and you'll be just about there. You'll have an opportunity to visit. Some of our lecturers will be there. I'm not sure all of them will be, but we invite you to come and talk about what you've learned and just enjoy just our fellowship of all of your fellow attendees. Finally, after tonight's lecture, we will begin the process of developing next year's lecture series. It really isn't long after the series is over that we begin thinking about next year. If you have ideas of topics or faculty members here at the campus that you would like to hear from, please let us know. We'll have little forms at the reception where if you have ideas, suggestions about topics, we do want to hear from you. It's how we expand and continue our series for the community. Afterwards, if you look around, you'll see we've got some posters from some of our past lecture series. And next year is our 20th year providing these lectures. And so we're hoping that you'll join us in helping shape the future of our programs in the coming years. With that, it is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome our final lecturer tonight, John C. Quindry. So please give a welcome for John.
Thanks so much. I'm on, right? You can hear me. Thanks for the invite. If you don't know me, it's probably not surprising. I'm new to town. My wife and my teenage kids, we moved here last summer. And I can say the four of us have never been happier to live and work and educate somewhere than right here. We've been very, very happy. And so I can summarize the entire talk by just saying to you that heart attacks are really, really bad and exercise is really good. Now we can head next door and have a drink and celebrate it. But to be quick, I'll give you a first sample, and I'm only going to show you a couple data slides. I'm not going to bore you with too many facts and figures, but this is showing the incidence of heart disease over the last century. And the major manifestation of heart disease is ischemic heart disease, which in other words is a heart attack. And the rise of heart attack came post-World War II, and it marked an increase in sedentary living when the entire world became mechanized, and the heart attack became such a problem from about the late 1960s and to today that it became high comedy. There was a sitcom called Sanford and Son where the running joke was this main character would feign a heart attack to manipulate his friends and family. And I don't know that it was all that funny, but that's where the country was. You move forward 20 years and Saturday Night Live has a different take on the heart attack with the super fan, these people out of the Midwest where I grew up who have these atherogenic diets, and they just brag about how many heart attacks they've had and survived in sort of the Mike Ditka spirit of things. And so we know that heart attacks persist. We know they're bad. We also know they typically occur as a function of advancing age. And that's really all you're seeing with this data series. This is from a very famous medical scientific study. And the take-home message clearly is if you're male or female, the older you get, the more likely you are to suffer heart disease of one type or another. And heart attacks, again, are going to be the major manifestation of that disease. And so we know exercise is good, and I'm just going to give you some little snippets to sort of walk you along stepping stones of logic. And one of the key studies came not from a biologist or physiologist like me, but from an epidemiologist, someone who studies the population. And what he found raised my eyebrows. Let's just look at the two bars within that box. These are people who have had heart attacks. The bar on the far right is people who died when they had the heart attack, and then the bar on the left, this one, these are the people who lived. The difference is whether or not they were active at work. So the population they studied were dock workers in San Francisco, and this is right in the late 60s. And they found that people who had the same jobs, all of the things were the same. If they worked for a living as opposed to sat for a living, they did better when the heart attack occurred. I want to humanize this for just a moment. Imagine these are the workers, and the ones who were standing up were the ones who worked for a living, the ones who were sitting down had a desk job. And essentially what I'm telling you is they all had heart attacks, they all had atherogenic diets, they all smoked cigarettes, and the ones who were standing up, the ones who worked, they lived. That's the difference. And so what got my attention as a physiologist was a comment at the end of this paper, and here's what they said, and I'll abbreviate it. He said, the association between work activity and coronary mortality suggests physical activity, not formal exercise, just physical activity on the job, influences the myocardium or its function more than the atherosclerotic process. It's magnificent. And this is without a biological study. This is just, let's just count the numbers of heart disease incidence and death. And so what that really does is it brings up the key theme for this talk, and that is exercise is good. It improves your functional capacity. In other words, what you can do. And anything you can't do, or the loss of functional capacity, is the natural or unnatural course of aging. That's what I'm really here to say. And that's outlined on this graph. Functional capacity is what we're talking about. And again, that's just a fancy word that means what you can do. It might mean that you can bench press 2 times your body weight. It might mean you can run the Missoula Marathon or the charity 5K. Or it might mean that you just walk around and work in the yard and garden. But here's the time course as a function of advancing age. You start, you can do less, and you very quickly, over the course of about a decade and a half, expand what you can do. And this is true for almost all of us. You still continue to advance your functional capacity into the 20s, where you have a peak, a physiologic peak, and then it's a downhill slope, and it's a very steady and gradual decline. As you age, this is natural, this is unavoidable. And then right in about, on average, the 8th decade, with most of us living to about 80 plus or minus a few years, what you get is a very steep and precipitous drop in functional capacity that's then associated with a loss of independence, and that's characterized by this dashed line. As you lose this independence, that might mean going to a nursing home or hospice, or having some special care. As you approach that line, just above that line, that is where you have infirmity, the people who are chronically sick. And it turns out, what I'm saying is the higher you can go, that is fighting aging. And exercise allows you to fight aging just by virtue of raising your functional capacity. And what I'm going to show you in a couple slides today is that this occurs independent of age. It really is a fountain of youth. And here's a take-home message. If you can see that figure, it's an artificial picture, but it's a baby foot, pushing out. If you can start young is the message, it's better. Here's a modification of that normal curve. If somebody is active and healthy and athletic right out of the womb, what they do is they advance just like all the rest of us, except they advance for a few years longer and they can do more. And they do much better in middle age. They have a higher peak, but look where they're still peaking in their 30s, some people, when the rest of us are on a decline, and they maintain that peak into middle age till about 50 is where the aging starts to affect people. But then they have the same rate of decline, and what you'll notice is that eventually age gets them, and the data are a little bit confusing, but they probably live a few years longer. But what's key is that the slope of this line is such that they spend less time being dependent on others, and they have less time being infirm. And so if you want to run to the top of Mount Sentinel, this might be for you. But if it's too late, if you've already passed your prime and you can't restore youth, there's no DeLorean and a flux capacitor, well then you're stuck with it. What does it look like? Dr. Brent Ruby is an example of this super fit, but they're statistically anomalous. Well, let's not talk too much more about that. I want to talk about two more statistical anomalies. One is, and I used to experience this, the patients when I worked in cardiac rehab would say, I know what you're telling me about diet, I know what you're telling me about exercise, but I had an aunt or I had an uncle, and then they'll tell me this story or a variation of this story. And if you want to play the Vegas odds, then you can consider these anecdotal instances, but otherwise, what you have to remind yourself is this is not usual. And think of how much longer and better she would have lived if she'd lived differently, and think of how he would have not lived as long had he not been healthful. And so I think that's the real take-home message. But again, I want to move away. These are three instances of statistical anomalies. What I really want to get back to is this traditional path of aging and physical capacity. And I want to actually have you think about how typical is this traditional model? And here's what I want you to remember. We started by talking about the incidence of heart disease. Remember, during the post-World War II era was when the world became utterly mechanized and we became sedentary as a population. And then in the period, the 40 or 50 years since heart disease has been the leading cause of death, what happened? Remember, we learned some lessons from the dock workers. If they were active, they did better. They survived. Well, what has happened in these 60 years? Here's what the data show. If you measure their occupational physical activity, in other words, how many calories do they burn while on the job, look what's happened in the same time frame, 1960 to 2010. It's gone down. It continues to go down, indicating we continue as a population to be sedentary. What is that doing to our functional capacity, and what is that doing to our health outcomes? And the answer is that we no longer have this traditional life trend. What we have is the modern reality. And this means that you have a lower peak capacity. Now, if you're 20 years old, this is still pretty good. You can hike really, really vigorously to the M with this functional capacity. But then you have the same slope in middle age. And look what happens to the slope of this later line. You spend more time dependent upon others, and you approach this threshold where you're infirm for a much longer period of time. This is not a good quality of life. The final point is that these people are not living as long. And there's the expectation that anybody who's under about the age of 30, the life expectancy in this country, the richest country in the history of all mankind, the life expectancy is probably going to go down, much of that attributable to lifestyle factors. It's just terrible. Okay, and my message is inactivity is advancing the aging process, and cardiovascular disease is the most likely outcome. So what are we to do? Well, when I personal trained, when I worked in cardiac rehab, I kept it to two simple take-home messages. Let's not talk over this too much. One is the more you can do, the better off you are. That's the super fit scenario. If that's too late for you, and it is for most of us, the second one is the real take-home message I want for you, and that is some activity is better than nothing at all. Anything is better than nothing at all. And to illustrate that, I have this figure. Here we have sedentary on the left-hand side of the screen, super fit on the right-hand side of the screen. The benefits are shown in green, and the risks are shown in red. And I just want to keep your attention on the left-hand side of the screen. The biggest benefits, the green line goes up representing the benefits accrue significantly while there's a minuscule increase in risk. And this is just going from sedentary to daily activity, and maybe a little bit more for activity for health. And so if you can make just this sort of transition, the health benefits are the most dramatic. These are the things that Reed Humphreys talked to you about on February 7th, essentially. Not just about heart disease, but the total body health. And so this is fantastic news. And so you may be saying to yourself, wait a minute, Quindry, I came all the way out here, got dressed up to hear you say exercise is good and it combats aging. That's it. That's your message. It is. You should feel like Dorothy, where she gets to the end of the movie and she says, the whole time, click my heels, I'm gone. And yeah, sorry, that's the message. But there's a few more facets about this that I want you to consider. There's 4 points that I want to leave you with in terms of exercise in the cardiac fountain of youth. The first one is, if you exercise a lot, especially right out of the womb, exercise is going to remodel the heart in a beneficial way. The people who ride bikes all the time, run all the time, they get these benefits. What does it mean? It means the heart remodels. The muscle of the heart is built up just like the muscle of your biceps if you work out all the time. It means the blood vessels of the heart are more advanced. There's extra blood vessels. The blood vessels respond exactly the way they should. That's a good thing. I expect everybody coming in the door had some general notion of this, and this is really more of the super fit discussion. So if you're super fit, good, we've confirmed that you're probably in great shape. If you're beyond the super fit days, if you've missed that bus, no worries. The next 3 points are for you. So again, here's the super fit model. We'll leave that one aside. I promise I won't bring it up again. Point number 2 of 4. Exercise prevents disease through the risk factor modification. Now, there's a whole bunch of modifiable risk factors. We can change our lifestyle in a beneficial way. I'm really only going to focus on 2, but I'll mention the key ones just in brief. So here's our heart. We're thinking about the heart. Inactivity is one of the most potent risk factors that's modifiable. Well, that's what we're talking about tonight, so we can leave that one aside. Blood pressure. Does exercise modify blood pressure independent of all the other factors? And the answer is yes. In most individuals, exercise will improve blood pressure dramatically, if not even a little bit. Next up is blood glucose control, blood sugar, and the control of the diabetic condition. We could almost talk the whole night on this, and I'm just going to give it mention now. But a single bout of exercise will improve blood sugar control from the cellular level to the organ level to the whole body level. A single bout of exercise. And if you are pre-diabetic or somebody you know is pre-diabetic or diagnosed, you need physical activity, if not formal exercise, essentially every day, 365 days a year. But just a few bouts, 10 minutes, accumulated exercise will reverse, at least in part, this process. Smoking, we know that's terrible for heart health. In general, people who engage in physical activity on a regular basis are less likely to smoke, so these are inversely related characteristics of the lifestyle. But here's where I want to slow down. Obesity is next. Obesity, from my perspective as somebody who promotes lifestyle change for good health, obesity has taken a real hit in popular media as of late. There's a lot of people who were saying, journalists who are saying, well, you can't fight obesity with exercise because we out-eat the food, we out-eat the calories we burn during the exercise. But I want you to consider this. These are very famous data. It's the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. And that's a name only a scientist can love. But the take-home message is, as the states change color, the darker the color, the greater the obesity. Now, it's most prominent in the Deep South. Let's just look at the last 5 or so years. I'm just going to flash through year at a time, 2012, 13, 14, 15. So Montana, we're in the part of the country where people fare better, but the entire population is gaining weight, and such that the average notion of a person is completely changing. Michelangelo would have to carve a completely different David these days. And the reason I want to bring this up is because society is sort of talking to us like obesity isn't a major and considerable public health problem. And it is. And I don't mean to poke fun, but we as a society have embraced obesity. And I want you to consider this from a pop cultural perspective. This is a slide of my kids when we lived in the Deep South before moving here. We go for a hike. We came across this crazy tree. And you won't be surprised to find I didn't have to tell my kids to climb that tree. They just did it, as we would. And the point is, we're born being physically active, and yet somehow we've trained our psyches and our bodies to be physically inactive. This is a picture of Jim Gaffigan, the famous comedian who has popularized, I'm just going to relax, I'm going to eat whatever I want. And he's super funny. I love his jokes. I love his jokes about overeating and being inactive. But I think this is the notion that we take home today. And on the topic of pop culture and obesity, there was a movie that was an excellent movie, but it's not just for kids if you're willing to watch an animated film. It's called WALL-E, and essentially the world is so polluted, the human race has to leave into a big spaceship. And on this spaceship, all people do is watch screens and sit and consume, and everybody is obese. And I thought it was an excellent movie. I thought their points were on target. And this movie had huge criticism from the popular press because of the characterization of the obese people. Well, I don't know if I want to argue that point, but a few years before this movie, there was a different one called Shallow Hal. Now, Shallow Hal, this is a little bit more of a raunchy film, but the premise is that you have this guy, Shallow Hal, played by Jack Black, and he is as sleazy as they come, and he judges everybody based upon their initial appearance. And in this case, he dates this lady who's morbidly obese, but he's been given a magic potion so that he only sees the true character of her soul. And what he sees then is a svelte Gwyneth Paltrow. And you can see from this picture right here, he's kayaking or canoeing with somebody who's obese. So the entire movie is filled with these really, really sophomoric, off-color, obese jokes, and they somehow get away with it. This had some critical acclaim, and the reason is they're sending the correct message, which is we need to embrace the person, not the condition. And I think we're getting to a place where we all appreciate that, but it doesn't mean that the individual who's gained weight doesn't have a condition that is going to lower their longevity and decrease their quality of life. There's a popular sandwich shop that had a media blitzkrieg a number of years back, and I'm not going to mention their spokesperson. That person was famous for a while and now is infamous and is a felon. But the message that person sent was no less important. They said, why don't you just walk somewhere to get a meal? Do you have to eat a foot long? How about just eating 6 inches? And ultimately, the message is, let's find compromise between physical activity and exercise. The way we consume, because we consume to solve problems, the way we consume and how we exercise for weight control. And I think it's a good message. I think that marketing campaign not just made them billions of dollars, but it did more than the nutrition and exercise world, I think, did collectively in the same period of years to advance a really well-rounded lifestyle that's balanced. Okay, so obesity is there. The final one is blood cholesterol. Please forgive this figure, but I want to summarize it quickly. Exercise does really only 3 things to improve your blood cholesterol. It can lower triglycerides, it can lower the bad cholesterol, which is LDL that's being dumped down here, and it can increase HDL, the good cholesterol that takes it away. What are the things that promote the laying down of cholesterol? An atherogenic diet is one of them. Being obese is another. And familial dyslipidemia, so there's the big 3. These are the bad guys. Exercise is the good guy. So what is exercise doing? Well, first and foremost, it combats obesity. We said that specifically. The more obese you are, the more likely you are to have high triglyceride levels. It's not just about diet, but it's how much weight you carry. So we know exercise will combat that. An acute bout of exercise will lower the triglyceride level. So even if you're carrying a few extra pounds, if you exercise regularly, it will combat at least part of the obesity contribution to bad cholesterol. It's wonderful. Next up is family dyslipidemia. The bad news, exercise is almost a panacea for everything. It won't cure the family dyslipidemia. So if your parents had high cholesterol and you do too, you might need to be on lipid-lowering drugs. Exercise won't cure that. We need to respect that risk factor. And then finally, there's diet. Just as we have embraced a world where it's it's a good idea to carry a few extra pounds. We've embraced a world where it's a good idea to eat like we know we shouldn't eat. This is a real restaurant in the Phoenix area. Look, hey, let's have a look at their menu. Let's see what they're offering. We have single, double, triple, and quadruple bypass burgers, flatliner fries. I hear they have wheelchairs inside the restaurant. I'm sure these people are making money hand over fist, but what they're really saying is they're just ushering you to the right-hand side of that functional capacity. They're ushering you to an early aging and early disease, I believe. Now, all things in moderation, so the good news with exercise is it can acutely alter the blood lipid response to a high-fat diet. What I mean is, in all things in moderation, there's our heart-shaped pizza. You like what I did there? You can have a couple slices of pizza, and if you do, you're going to get a big spike in blood lipids, but if you exercise, you can mitigate that a little bit. Not the whole thing, but if you're going to have a little bit of fat in your diet, no problem. Now, we're all going to do it from time to time. Make sure you get some exercise in because that will combat the acute spike in lipids. And so that's a take-home message. That's very important. Even acute exercise will beneficially modify your blood lipids after a fat-laden meal. This might be the most important thing I tell you today. Okay, so to finish this section, exercise improves all modifiable risk factors for cardiovascular disease, and with the obesity, with the lipids, I've tried to give you a sense that exercise and physical activity are really amenable to the modern lifestyle. We don't have to have exercise or being happy. I don't believe that's true, even if you don't like to exercise. Point number 3 of 4. Exercise rejuvenates the diseased heart. I'm going to give you one data point. This is me, by the way, 20 years ago this semester, working my final days in cardiac rehab before I went back to get a doctorate in biomedical sciences and study what I study. That was a brown-haired version of me. Here's the study. This is from a colleague of mine. And this is before and after cardiac rehab. So these are middle-aged people, about my age, maybe a few years older. They have a heart attack, some diagnosis of heart disease. They go to cardiac rehab for 3 months. On the front and back end, they performed what's called a 6-minute test. This is a great test because it's really in line with what you would do on a regular day. So you take the heart patient before and after and you say, I want you to walk up and down this hallway. And we're going to time it for 6 minutes. We're going to see how many laps you do, and we're going to quantify how far you walk. So this is a real pragmatic, practical way to measure this. And what you can see is after cardiac rehab, these exact same people, they walked much, much farther. Now, when we in the exercise world take out our tables and we look at what is superior or pretty good or average or below average, what we find is this performance conversion, it's essentially an aged to young performance conversion. You knew there was going to be a picture of Ponce de Leon in this, right? This really is the fountain of youth. Forget what I said about cholesterol. This is the most important thing I've told you yet tonight. So we've gotten rid of our traditional notion of the average American, and we've come back up with this is the modern version. What I'm telling you is a little bit of exercise allows you to regain youth. It improves your functional capacity, and look down here. This is where the disease sets in. The slope of that line is important. Less time below the dependence threshold and less time in that infirmity range. This is absolutely fantastic news. Point number 4. Exercise confers youthful heart chemistry. It protects the heart when heart attacks occur. Quindry, I don't know about this. Chemistry? That was a long time ago. Maybe I never had chemistry. I'll keep this story simple. And to do this, here's a picture of my wife. This is from about 25 years ago. She's faking a heart attack in Chicago at a museum. The amazing thing is she stayed fit, and she doesn't look much different 25 years later. So to tell this story, you have to have heart attacks, and that means we have to have animal models to study this. And I want to bring this up, if for no other reason. I've been in this community a little while, and I've noticed there's a little bit of well-intended misinformation about animal research. And I want to convey to you that if you want to have a cure for disease, there's no computer model that will do it. You have to do the experiments. You have to have physiology. It's a preclinical trial. And so I want to convince you that animals can exercise like people. And I'm using silly pictures to show you this, but essentially, when we prescribe exercise to people, we use what's called the FIT principle. How often do you exercise? How intense? How much time? And what do you do? And these are just examples. So if we're going to have a real animal model, we need to prescribe exercise to an animal on scale as we would with humans. And students come into my lab, they say, well, this sounds fun, that's so cute. A mouse or a rat on a treadmill, and they get excited, and then they find out it's really boring, just like watching humans exercise. You just have to sit there and do it. The difference is you have to clean up the droppings of these subjects. So we exercise them like humans, and can we put them on a MET card? If you've been to the Healthy Heart program on campus that Dr. Steve Gaskell is running, and now I'm taking over, we'll measure your VO2, your metabolic rate during exercise. Well, we do that in humans. Can we do it in mice? The answer is yes. Here's some pictures from my lab. There's a mouse in there. This is a stress test on a mouse. So we can do these things. These are silly pictures from The Onion, but I want to emphasize the importance of daily physical activity, not formal exercise, just activity. Just be active in your lifestyle. Garden, mow the lawn, walk the dog. And I want to remind you that just as humans and animals have daily activity in the same way. So if it's an experimental model, what if we put a mouse or a rat in a cage with a running wheel, and we let them exercise not how we think they should, let them self-select. How do they do? And it turns out they have the same total volume of exercise than if we prescribed it. The animals know how to exercise. Isn't that amazing? They don't need the Center for Disease Control to tell them. They'll just do it. Are their hearts protected? And magically, they are. It's just phenomenal. So the next thing I want to convince you is that animals have disease like humans have disease. And no one animal model perfectly recapitulates disease. But as a collective body of work, they do. We have obese mice, we have mice that have all the different diseases, heart attacks, they have dyslipidemia, they have metabolic syndrome. We can overfeed them, we can do all the things we can expose them. Here at UM, they have one of the best facilities to expose animals to air pollution. And we can get a sense of what happens. And we need them to have heart attacks. Now in this case, we need to do this in a humane way. So these are from my lab. This is called the RICU, Rat Intensive Care Unit. We anesthetize the animals, they feel no pain, they're asleep but very much alive. We open up the heart and tie off a coronary vessel, and we plug just that one heart vessel the same way a blood clot would plug just that one coronary vessel, causing a heart attack. And we can put it in, we can reverse it the same way it would get reversed when somebody with a heart attack reports to the ER. Here's the physiologic data. The top tracing, well, that's an EKG, just like people. It's identical. In fact, we use clinical criteria to grade these. This is, because it's a surgery, we can measure blood pressure from within the main arteries of the animal. And you can see, oh, this is bad. Even if you can't read an ECG, you know lots of squiggly lines, that's not good news. What happens to blood pressure simultaneously? Oh, it drops. If this was a person having a heart attack, they would faint. The blood pressure, in this case, systolic blood pressure is below 60 millimeters of mercury. I don't know too many people who could stand up under that. So this is a very similar heart attack. That's the RICU. This is the MICU. This is the Mouse Intensive Care Unit. These aren't technically any harder than the rat experiments, except they're 1/10 the size. I don't want to hear that noise, but that's a heart having a heart attack, 300 and some beats per minute. It all has to be done under a microscope, but it's the same heart attack that people have. Another thing we can do is we can keep the rodent heart alive in the same way that you would have a heart transplant. So you take the heart out, you keep it on ice, and then you in this case, you give it fake blood. And you can control how hard it beats. It's just like an animal. There's another brown-haired version of me doing something that a gray-haired version of me would have to do these days. Well, what's the point to you? In any of these animal models, we can look for the same clinical markers of heart attack damage that we do in humans. And in this case, what's shown here, red is for sedentary, green is for exercised. What's on this bar axis is the cardiac markers of heart attack. So you suspect a heart attack, you go to the hospital, you have blood drawn, and you look for cardiac markers of damage. And if they're high, it's bad. And what we're seeing here, this is a surgically induced heart attack. The markers are very high. If that person exercises, the markers go way down. Not all the way down, but it's largely protected. This is really good news. So if we think of the clinical markers for a heart attack, the first thing that happens is a change in the ECG. We can measure that. Next, the heart muscle stops functioning right. That's where the person might faint. Can we measure the heart muscle pump function? Yes. Can we measure it with cardiac echo or MRI the same way in humans? We can and we do. Can we measure blood pressure the same way? Absolutely. Can we do post-mortem analyses to measure exactly how the tissue died, and can we look at the circulating markers of damage just like a human? The difference is that we can actually do a lot more because, in this case, it is ethical to understand, and if we want a new cure for heart disease, this is exactly what has to happen. So let me show you something that I think is going to blow you away. These are studies that happened in the lab where I trained. After the doctorate, I did some more training called a postdoctorate. And in this case, the people before me exercised animals on a treadmill, and they gave them a surgically induced heart attack similar to what I've described. The heart attack occurs between these dashed lines. The marker is blood pressure development. In other words, if the heart is doing okay, this line stays steady. Green is for exercised, red is for sedentary. The exercised animals exercised for only 2.5 months, and look what happens during the heart attack. The heart muscle function is almost unchanged during and after a heart attack. It's absolutely magnificent. 2.5 months, that's not a Lance Armstrong rodent. That's not a marathon running rodent. That's just a couple weeks, 2.5 weeks, 10 weeks on a treadmill. And they did that much better than the sedentary animal. All right, now check this out. It's almost the same experimental design. It's a similar measure of heart pumping function. If the level stays steady, that's a good sign. You're surviving the heart attack. And in this case, it wasn't weeks or months of exercise. It was 3 days or 5 days. All right, you ready to be amazed? You ready? Here it is. The 3 and 5 days were just as protected as the 2.5 months. I changed my mind what I told you before. This is the most important thing I've told you tonight. This is absolutely amazing. Look what happens. Just 3 days of exercise. So I show up in the lab right after this study gets published, and we decide how hard does the exercise has to be. In other words, we're saying how little can the exercise be, and you still get these benefits. And I'm not going to show you the data, but for the sake of time, high intensity exercise, they're protected. How about low to moderate intensity exercise? They're still protected. There's a low threshold, meaning a little bit of exercise gives you a huge dose of protection. Because it's only 3 days, it can't be remodeling. There's not new blood vessels. The heart's not bigger and stronger. Only 3 days. You couldn't build biceps for spring break in 3 days, and that takes a long time. This has to be biochemistry. How long does this effect last? In other words, what's your return on investment? 3 days on a treadmill? What's that actually buy you? So we did this experiment when I was there. The same scheme and color. This is the sedentary heart. And 100% means the heart is not damaged. Anything less than that is the damage. So in this case, we give a surgically controlled heart attack, and you lose about 1/3 of the heart muscle pump function. We had 4 different groups of exercised animals. We put them on the treadmill just 3 days, and then we looked at them 1 day after exercise, and lo and behold, they're protected. Not completely protected, but mostly protected. We took a second group, and we waited 3 days after their little exercise bout, and they're still protected. We looked 9 days, a week and a half after their last 3 bouts of exercise, and they're still protected. Isn't that amazing? It wasn't until we had a 4th group of exercised animals, we waited 18 days, about 2.5 weeks, and then we did the same heart attack, and we found they were no longer protected. They were, in effect, a sedentary heart once again. This is magical, is it not? Here's what I'm saying. If you are planning a heart attack, all you have to do is get a couple days of exercise just prior to that heart attack, maybe a week and a half, and you're going to do much, much better. If you don't have the crystal ball, if you don't have the Ouija board or the magic 8 ball, then what you need to consider is exercising on a semi-regular, if not regular basis, and you are going to do much better. Is the heart sexist? We need to ask these questions. Does 3 days of exercise protect the male and the female heart? And the answer is yes. The data on the left are males, the data on the right are females. Again, red is sedentary, exercised is green. The higher the bar, the worse the heart attack. So it's the difference in males, the difference in females that speaks to the protection. They're both equally protected. Is the heart ageist? Are young and old hearts protected? All these experiments I've shown you were done in very young animals. Why? Because these are very costly experiments. To look at an animal that's equivalent to my age or the oldest person, whoever that is in this room, very expensive. But I did this study, and I did this study because we need to know how it works in the aging heart. But if somebody survives a heart attack, one of the key things that might happen to them is they might contract and die of heart failure. Oh, what a terrible outcome. And so we looked at a marker that was indicative of heart failure. And essentially what happens, if the heart survives the heart attack, it dies slowly. And we don't need to talk about the biological process, but I was able to take the hearts after exercise and after the heart attack and just look at them chemically for a marker that would be indicative of heart failure. And we did this microscopically, and so to do it, we stain the hearts and look at their nuclei, and that's blue. And you don't need to remember what a nucleus is. Biology was too long ago. Just follow the colors. Blue is a nucleus that's healthy. Green is a nucleus that's dying. That's heart failure. We wanted to quantify where the heart muscle cells are, and so here we put them all together, and we just analyze them. This heart muscle cell is doing great, so is that one, but these guys are goners, and that's bad. And here's what we found. The young comparison is on the right, or the young comparison's on the left. The old comparison is on the right. And I'm showing you the red to green comparison because that's sedentary versus exercised. Now what we'll notice is all the bars are higher in the aged hearts. These are about the equivalent of an 80-year-old human being. What that tells us is the aged heart is less resilient. But will the aged heart respond to 3 days of exercise? Answer, yes. The magnitude of this improvement is identical, independent of age. And what this is saying is that if there's a heart attack and you exercise and you're above the age of about 40 years old, you are still going to be protected. Forget what I said before. This is the most important thing I've told you tonight. This is amazing. This is absolutely fantastic news. So what I'm telling you is, when these heart attacks occur at the end of life, what I'm telling you is a little bit of exercise is going to regain function, regain quality of life. QOL is quality of life. At some point, forget the charity 5K. I just want to interact with my grandkids. I would come home from my days in cardiac rehab and I would ask my wife, like, oh, it's Christmas time. Look at these gift cards I got from these people. I liked them. It was great to work with them. And I don't know why they would want to bring me brownies at Christmas time or bring me a gift card. And my wife is smart and she points out, you've changed their life. Look what they could barely walk when they came in. You worked with them a little bit. They just did what you said. And they increased their functional capacity threefold or fourfold, some of them. They went from barely being able to walk across a room to being able to continuously exercise at a brisk pace for 30 minutes. That's regaining youth. That is one of the most powerful things I've done in my life. So let me show you a one-slide overview for what I've done in the last 15 years. This is humbling. So these are animal experiments, and this represents all the different heart muscle cells that are having a heart attack. And I am not going to bore you with the chemical factors, but I wanted to know why. Not is exercise good? Yes, it's good. Why is exercise good? And I've interrogated the system one chemical at a time to discover why is it good. I'm not going to explain what those factors are, but here's what I'll tell you. They're all over the cell. It's comprehensive, and this is the changed biochemistry of the cell is what I'm telling you. And it perfectly matches the cellular pathology of a heart attack. Whatever those things are, we can talk about those specifics at another time. But I'm telling you, it matches the cellular pathology. It's amazing. 3 days of exercise will turn these things on. I hope at least one or two of you are saying, so what, Quindry? Good. The so what question is, why don't we use this to find a pill for exercise, for somebody who can't exercise? If you want to find a pill, you need to know what receptors are responding. Well, if you take some studies that we've done and published recently, we've figured this out. Here's what we found. 3 days of exercise will result in a chemical being released from the heart. It's similar to endorphins, but it turns out in this case it's not. But it activates a receptor, which then turns on this chemistry. This is even cooler. When you exercise, the skeletal muscle releases a different chemical that activates a receptor that turns on this chemistry. What I'm saying is the tissues of the body will talk to each other in a chemical way and tell them to be protected. Guess what I'm about to say? Isn't that cool? I can't tell you how many nights I've stayed up just thinking about this and getting excited. I love data. Okay, so that's it. Those are my 4 points. I didn't want to go long tonight. What I'm telling you is a couple days of exercise will confer superior heart protection. Do you want to be a superhero? Be active. But there's a problem. 90% of the people in our country, by most standards, do not meet not just exercise, but physical activity standards. So what I'm telling you is, here's the super heart, but this might be our modern reality. Another way to say this, to turn a classic biblical phrase, to some extent the flesh is willing, but the spirit is weak. And I'm not sure I know how to combat this, but a few years ago, I inherited a student at one of my first faculty jobs, and we did this really cool study. And this is a little bit outside of my area, but it's been one of my favorite studies. We went to a fitness facility, and we essentially asked, if you're coming to the fitness facility, why do you come? Why do you exercise? And we used a standardized survey, and we quantified people from the teens to the 80s. And we quantified them in 15-year increments, and we asked them based upon intrinsic factors, extrinsic factors, psychological factors. We asked them about their health concerns and their physical ability. And here's what we found. It was very, very interesting. Follow the color change. When they're young, they exercise for intrinsic factors. There's a lot more nuances to this, but if you want to boil it down, they wanted to figure out who they were as a physical being, essentially. Once you got to adult and middle-aged, what we found was they exercised for external and extrinsic factors. They wanted to look better. Maybe they wanted to win their age group in a charity run or do the walk for cancer charity event. Once they got to middle age, where I am now, they primarily exercised for psychological factors. They recognized that exercise made them feel better. They gave them a better outlook on life. And once they got to the oldest populations, which was really about age 60 and above, they exercised primarily because they had health concerns, and they recognized that regular physical activity was improving the way they aged. There's one final component. It's the physical ability, and that was the only factor that we found was important to people who exercise independent of age. Physical ability, well, that's the functional capacity tracing I've shown you about 6 times in this talk. They recognize the more you can do, the better off you are, and they recognize there's a use it or lose it factor, so they're going to exercise to maintain that. This is great news for the 10% of the people who are doing this on a regular basis. What about the other 90? Well, I think this psychological profile is still in place. The difference is we have to remove the barriers to exercise. So think to yourself, what are those barriers? Is it I need a fitness facility nearby, I need a partner to do it with, it costs time, it costs money. Remove those barriers, and I suspect the people who exercise and the people who don't will see eye to eye. And so it's time to close. And I want to close by saying heart disease is a top public health concern. We have a society that is physically disengaged, very immobile as a group, and it's costing us money, it's costing us quality of life. The human toll is immeasurable. Exercise, for the most part, is a panacea of health. It won't let you live forever, but it will let you live much longer. And I've given you some anecdotal evidence, little snippets of how aging can reverse on a cellular level, on a single bout of exercise, can alter the aging process. You get the biggest bang for your buck if you transition from sedentary to physically active, the biggest bang for your buck. And you get a little bit more bang for your buck if you go from physically active to physically fit. And that's it. Not super fit, just kind of fit. It accrues in a dose-dependent fashion. And I want to remind you of something I said early on tonight. Accumulated physical activity. So I'm not going to give you a Forrest Gump accent, but get up off the bench, and I want you to consider this accumulated physical activity. My grandparents, who are now gone, they used to say, we don't want to exercise. We get enough doing our chores. And that's a reasonable point to make, especially when people get older. If you can do 3 10-minute bouts of activity, walk the dog 3 times, 10 minutes, the health benefits will accrue. This is an indisputable health fact. And so I have this M.C. Escher drawing to remind us. And back in my day, we walked uphill both ways. We didn't have shoes. We dipped our feet in paint. We were glad to have it. Let's regain that attitude, and let's just get outside and be active. You don't like to exercise? You had a bad PE coach who punished you with exercise? Don't worry about it. Just be fit. Just be active. What do you like to do? Let's make it part of what we do on a daily basis. Do it a little bit more intensely, perhaps. Maybe do it for a few more minutes. But pick the things you like. Don't do the things you don't like. This is my final slide. I want to focus on some activity is better than nothing. And when I was a personal trainer, I primarily personal trained people that are represented in this crowd. Older individuals who wanted to get back into shape and regain some youth, and in cardiac rehab. And I would say, where do you fit? You're an athlete. Where do you fit on the spectrum? I beg to differ, Quindry. I am not an athlete. I say, I think you are. Are you dead? No. Are you an Olympic athlete? No. Okay, it's like, but you're somewhere on the spectrum between there. Fair, okay. Well, here's the thing. The Center for Disease Control, the American College of Sports Medicine, they say do a certain amount of exercise and you'll get health benefits. Where are you relative to that? They'll say, I'm about right there. Like, okay, I just want to push you to the right, at least a little bit, and see what happens. Maybe some people I can only push them a little bit, but we know you're going to get huge benefits in this first half of this spectrum. So how much are you willing to do? If this is too much and you're not going to adhere to the exercise program, well then just do this much. Let's start small. And so what I'm telling you in closing is super fit, great, traditional. We really just need to return to traditional. But if it is too late for that, if we have this modern physique to contend with, well, let's exercise as early as we can to regain youth. And if it's too late for that, let's get some exercise in to regain our quality of life. And that's my message. It's simple. So, yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Now, before we get into our questions, Chris Comer, who is on our committee, had a few remarks. Chris, where did you end up? There he is. A few remarks, and then we'll go into the question and answer part of the program.
I'm sorry, I didn't change it. You want to reset slides. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay, I'll be brief because I know we have some questions you're probably anxious to answer, to ask and get answered, and we have reception. So I just wanted to step up here for a minute on behalf of my brother and sister deans to give you a meta message about this whole series. There are 4 colleges that are primarily involved in providing healthcare training and healthcare clinical services on this campus. And we thought it'd be useful to just make sure that you learned a little bit about that. We talked about it in the very first lecture. I just wanted to remind you toward the end here. This slide just shows what's going on in terms of the programs in health and medicine on the campus. And Reed Humphrey on the first night talked about UMHM, University of Montana Health and Medicine. That logo is going to now be on the doors of lots of laboratories and lots of clinics on the campus. So students can come here, as you probably know this, but just to reinforce it, and they can train in the 2-year Missoula College for quick entry into the healthcare workforce. But they can also come for 4-year degrees or graduate training and end up like a scientist, like Dr. Quindry. So there's an awful lot that's going on the campus, and the fact that it's 4 colleges is important. We have a health professions college, and they are taking the lead, but there are 4 other colleges that are deeply involved in this. One is Missoula College, our two-year unit. Secondly is the college that you just heard from tonight, the Phyllis J. Washington College of Education and Health, Human Sciences. Then the College of Health Professions and Biomedical Sciences, and last, the biggest college, the College of Humanities and Sciences. All 4 of these colleges have linked arms to perform the functions of UMHM. They're all training students. And a couple of facts you should know. One of the things that's unique about UM is the average rate of getting students into medical school, for example, is typically something like 40%. On our campus, it's 80%. So we knock the ball out of the park just about every year. That's not a heavily known fact, but it's time the public knew about that on this campus. What UMHM is doing is trying to make sure that that kind of attention to pre-medical studies covers all the health professions. There's so many that are taking place on the campus. So for example, you can learn respiratory therapy at Missoula College. You can do sports medicine in College of Education. You can do molecular genetics related to heart disease and immune function in my college. And you can do studies on environmental health in the College of Health Professions. All of these things are happening. And I think if you look at it, the message across these lectures was really interesting to me. Everybody said in one way or another, you have control over your own destiny. You can influence your health outcomes. And the phrase was, use it or lose it. I'm not a cardiac guy, I'm a neurophysiologist, but it's the same thing for the brain. If you don't use it, you lose it. And that's how to have extended quality of life in a mental sense. But the other thing that's really interesting is you've heard from 6 of our really fine scientists on this campus. And that's the other thing we can do is when you need expert help, you can get it from I want you to think about the fact that is part of the healthcare delivery system for Missoula County. The clinics at there are a host of clinics on this campus. I'm only showing some of them. And everything from neuropsychological assessment to assessing cardiac function to working with kids who are experiencing trauma happens on this campus every day. Patients arrive on the campus, they get great treatment, and they go home with an improved life. So when you think of the University of Montana, do think of us as the broad-based educational institution we are, but also think of us as a clinical provider to this county. And that's something we're very proud of. So I just wanted to point that out, and I want to congratulate Dr. Quindry on an awfully wonderful lecture tonight, and I'm sure he'll be ready to take your questions. Thanks.
What we do is we have microphones that will be out in the audience, and when people have questions, it's time for the question and answer period. We have microphones. When you want to ask a question, please use the microphone. It's the only way we'll get your question recorded for the video. So if we don't get your question, it sounds like Dr. Quindry is just answering some ephemeral notion in his head. So please use the microphones. And who has questions? Come on. Here's one.
Thank you. Hi, I was wondering if you could talk about the different effects different types of exercise have. So weightlifting versus running on a treadmill.
Great question. I didn't have time to show you all the data. The question is, does fill in the blank exercise cardioprotect the heart? Short answer, yes. And there's plenty of studies to show it. It doesn't matter what you do. You need very little volume, very little dose, cardio, strength. It's all protective.
Other questions? Who's going to start exercising tomorrow? There's a question right there.
I'm exercising at a pretty high level now. Do I need to increase it, or can I maintain at a certain level?
Yeah, the short answer there is that the threshold for protection is very, very low. Essentially, if you get up off the couch in any meaningful way, you'll be protected. Do you get more protection for the heart attack protection I showed you? Do you get more by protection by doing more exercise? And the answer, based upon some of the studies I've been involved with and some other labs, is probably not. It's almost like a chemical switch. You turn it on, you get this turning on of multiple factors that protect, but you don't get more of them turned on, or they don't get turned on in greater magnitude. And that's actually good news, I think. It means a little bit goes a long way.
So as a follow-up to that, I thought I saw a graph early on that showed, the benefits are all front-loaded, like you just talked about, but there was a risk component to your graph as well.
Yeah.
And so is there such a thing as too much as you get older? As I get older, do I need to worry about pushing myself to continue to improve as an athlete?
The risks do accrue. The higher the intensity, the longer the duration, the risks accrue. Most of those risks are minimal. So when the risks increase, we're still talking about a 1 in thousands, tens if not hundreds of thousands increase in risk. But they do increase. I think that red line that you're talking about is a little bit overstated in that simplified picture. But in short, if it's not marathon after marathon, if it's not ultra endurance where the people run for literally 24 hours, the risks, even in those individuals, the risks are minimal. The biggest risk for somebody who runs a marathon or an ultra endurance event is that in the 2 weeks following those events, they're at slightly increased risk for a head cold. So for all the benefits they do receive, the other ones are minimized. You may have heard of, somebody ran the Chicago Marathon, died of a heart attack. If you actually look at those numbers from an epidemiologic perspective, the likelihood of having a lethal outcome is 1 in a million, it's either 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million in those at risk. So again, the odds are exceedingly small, but when it does happen, the media jumps on it with the idea of saying, see, you shouldn't have exercised to begin with. It's a catch-22. But again, the risks are minimal. But again, it does accrue. The higher the intensity, the longer the duration. There's slightly more risk. Most of them are musculoskeletal. A knee pain, a back pain.
We hear that we need a lot of rest or a certain amount of sleep. How does that fit in with your projects?
It fits in great. If I could tell you to do a few things, it would be, yes, exercise, eat a well-balanced, nutrient-dense diet, consume alcohol in about 5 minutes in moderation, and get adequate sleep. Those are the 4 biggest things. I guess if there's a 5th thing, it would be to have good friends and family. But those 5 things, those are the most highly associated with good health outcomes.
Any more questions? Here's one right here.
What about that group that has dropped below the dotted red line and has become dependent? How do they do when they start exercising?
They do great, and that's only been a revelation in my professional lifetime for the most part. To give you a quick anecdotal example, I worked with a guy who was heir to, it's actually a company you've heard of, and he was heir to it, but had some cognitive dysfunction such that he was kept healthy. He was mostly free of disease, but got to be about 50 or 60 years old and had never done anything but sit in a chair all day long. And so when he had the first hint of a heart problem, they sent him to cardiac rehab as a prophylactic approach. And we had to start with a guy who was, by all intents and purposes, healthy, but could barely walk across a room. And we essentially brought him up out of that. And that's one of the many examples where somebody quadrupled their physical ability, and they got above that level of infirmity to where they can consistently perform 30 to 40 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, and that's changing their life. There are people that I also saw, especially in cardiac rehab, who could barely do their hair, barely walk across a room, and they would tell me for every rehab session they would want to get dressed up, and I can't figure out why, but it would take them 2 hours just to bathe and to look presentable. And by the time they finished rehab, not only could they exercise more, they could prepare themselves for rehab in 20 or 30 minutes, which is probably par for the course for any of us. And they'd regained their quality of life and their functional capacity. So, and these are people who were at or below that dotted line, and we brought them right up. So it can happen. Can it happen for everybody? And the answer is not for everyone. But in many instances it can.
Great. Any more questions? Okay, one more hand for Dr. Quindry, please. And will you now all please join us in the 3:30 rooms for some refreshments and conversation. And again, if you have ideas for next year's program, please share them with us.